Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into a really fascinating part of contract law called the Doctrine of Mistake. We're going to find out what happens when a major error slips into an agreement and whether that can make the whole contract just disappear. So let's kick things off with a question. Think about this. Can a tiny little error, maybe even a simple typo, completely blow up a legally binding contract? Well, the answer might surprise you. It's not a simple yes or no. It all comes down to what kind of mistake we're talking about. All right, here's the plan. First, we'll cover the basic idea of when a mistake can void a contract. Then we'll get into the three main types: common, mutual, and unilateral mistakes. And finally, we'll wrap up with why all of this really matters. So what exactly is this doctrine of mistake? Well, it's a legal rule that says if an error is so big, so fundamental to the whole point of an agreement, it can make the contract void. Essentially, the law looks at it and says, you know what, there was never a real agreement here in the first place. Okay, first up is what's called a common mistake, and the name gives you a pretty big clue. This is what happens when both people in the contract make the exact same mistake about something really important. The key thing to get here is that the parties actually do agree on something. The problem is, what they've agreed on is based on a totally wrong assumption that they both share. It's like they're perfectly on the same page, but that page is from the wrong book entirely. We can actually break this down even more. There are mistakes about whether the thing even exists, mistakes about who actually owns it, and mistakes about its quality. Now, those first two, existence and ownership, those are the heavy hitters. They go right to the core of the deal, and courts take them very seriously. A perfect case to show this involves a deal for a shipment of Indian corn. A buyer and a seller made a contract to sell the corn while it was still on a ship at sea. Seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Well, there was a tiny problem. Turns out, neither of them knew that the corn had already spoiled, and the ship's captain had sold it off. So when it went to court, the ruling was crystal clear. The contract was void. You just can't have a valid contract for something that doesn't even exist anymore. Okay, now for a case that is just bizarre. It sounds like something out of a comedy. A guy signed a contract with his cousins to rent a fishery. Yep, you heard that right. He was about to start paying rent on property that was already his. It turned out, through a family mix-up, he was the actual owner, and nobody knew it. Because both he and his cousins were completely mistaken about who the real owner was, the court said, nope, this contract is void. I mean, it makes sense, right? You can't lease something from someone else that you already own. And here's where things get really interesting. The courts draw a very clear line in the sand. If you're mistaken about if the thing exists or who owns it, that can often kill the contract. But if you're just mistaken about its quality, that's a whole different ballgame. Check this out. In a famous case, a gallery sold a painting that both they and the buyer were convinced was by the great artist John Constable. 5 years down the road, it was discovered to be a total fake. But when it went to court, the judge said the contract was still valid. Why? Because the contract was for the sale of that specific painting. And that's exactly what the buyer got. The mistake was about its quality and value, sure, but not its existence. A tough lesson for the buyer, for sure. All right, on to our second category, mutual mistake. Now, this isn't about a shared error. This is a whole different beast. This is about a complete and utter misunderstanding, where both parties are totally at cross purposes. So with common mistake, remember, they made the same mistake. Here, with mutual mistake, they're making different mistakes. They're basically talking past each other. There's no meeting of the minds, as lawyers like to say. So no real agreement was ever even formed. The absolute best example of this is an old case from 1864. A contract was drawn up for a bunch of cotton to be delivered from Bombay, India, on a ship named Peerless. Simple enough. Or so you'd think. Here was the problem. Believe it or not, there were two ships named Peerless sailing from Bombay with cotton. One was set to arrive in October, the other in December. And guess what? The seller was thinking of the December ship, but the buyer was expecting his cotton to be on the October one. And because the contract just said the ship Peerless, there was no way for an outsider to know which one they meant. The court looked at it and basically said, we have no idea what you guys actually agree to. There was no consensus, no real deal, so the contract was void. And that brings us to our final category, and this one adds a little bit of drama to the mix. It's called unilateral mistake. This is where only one person is mistaken, but, and this is the important part, the other person knows it. So you see, this isn't just an innocent slip-up. For a unilateral mistake to count, one party has to be operating under a false belief, and the other party knows it. And often, they're trying to use that mistake to their advantage. There's a fantastic case that explains this perfectly. It involved a deal for 30,000 Argentinian hareskins. Now, during all the back-and-forth negotiations, the price was always discussed per piece, per single skin. So all the verbal talks, all the previous offers, they were all based on a price of 10 pence for each individual hareskin. Everyone was on the same page. But then, when the seller sent over the final written offer, there was a typo, a huge one. The contract listed the price at 10 pence per pound of weight. Now, hareskins are super light, so pricing them by the pound made the total cost way, way cheaper, like a third of the intended price. The buyer saw this, knew it had to be a mistake, but tried to snap up the offer anyway, hoping to get an incredible deal. So, can you do that? Can you see an obvious mistake and just enforce it? The court said, no way. Since the buyer knew the seller had made a massive mistake in the offer, there was no valid contract. You can't just take advantage of someone else's clear error like that. Okay, so let's tie all of this together. We've talked about these 3 different types of mistakes. Why do these distinctions really matter so much in the world of law and business? So let's do a quick recap. A common mistake is a shared blunder, like trying to buy corn that isn't there. A mutual mistake is when you're on completely different wavelengths, like the 2 ships. And a unilateral mistake is when one person makes an error and the other one knows it, like with that hareskin typo. It all boils down to fairness and whether a genuine agreement ever really existed. At the end of the day, this part of the law is all about making sure that a contract is what it's supposed to be, a true agreement between people. And it leaves us with a really important question to ask ourselves anytime we make a deal. Is this agreement truly clear? Or is there some hidden misunderstanding just waiting to cause a major problem down the road?